Tenement rates, radio and television license fees. That one is even funny, 2025. Anyways, land use charge, police trust fund levy, Naseni levy, companies income tax, education tax, NIDA levy, capital gains tax, value added tax. All these and many, many more are the taxes that exist or existed in Nigeria. Every government agency that needed some revenue finds a way to introduce some tax. In fact, for most of us, if you're ever visited by the taxman, you can be so sure they will find something that you did not pay or you didn't even know you were supposed to pay. So in this series, I'll try my best to simplify the tax reforms that have been making rounds in Nigeria, and we'll start today by understanding why these reforms were even considered necessary in the first place. But if you're new here, welcome. My name is Temi, and I try to explain business, finance, and compliance concepts in a way that is clear, practical, and easy to follow. Now, because different agencies introduce different charges, levies, or taxes, the laws that govern these taxes are scattered across so many documents. But that's not the only thing. It also means if you need to pay many of the different taxes, you have to pay them to different agencies of government. In fact, federal and state governments would even fight on what to collect. Some of these revenues will go to different agencies entirely. This brings us to the first major thing the reforms tried to address. The reforms looked at all the major laws that were scattered all around and put them into a small set of 4 documents. One document talks about the taxes themselves. I think I'm going a little too fast. One document talks about the taxes themselves. The second one talks about how government will collect the taxes, make refunds, penalties for people that are non-compliant. That's the second one. The third one talks about who will collect federal government taxes, because not all taxes go to federal government. Some go to federal, some go to the states. So who will collect federal government taxes? That's the third document. And the last one talks about who will try to help us harmonize everything so that federal government will not charge you for one thing and then local government and state government will charge you for the exact same thing again. Let's go over that once again very carefully. So the first document, again, is the Nigerian Tax Act. It is the law that talks about the taxes we pay, the taxes we should pay, who should pay, how much they should pay, and how that amount is calculated. So instead of going into more than 20 documents to find out all the taxes that you need to pay, this becomes the primary place to look. However, I must quickly warn you, while this document tries to harmonize most of the taxes, there are still other compliance requirements that it does not cover. For example, pension, what we call NSITF, but those ones are mostly for companies. Also, there are still taxes and levies in the Constitution that have not been removed, but I think the National Assembly is working on some of those already. The second document is the Nigerian Tax Administration Act. This one is not even about how much tax you pay. It is about how should the system work in practice. So how would you submit your tax returns? Submitting your tax returns means telling the government how much you made and how much tax you are supposed to pay by yourself. This second document also talks about how do you make the payment. What happens if you don't pay your tax in the way that they have said you should pay it? Then the third document is the Nigeria Revenue Service Establishment Act. This one is the one, do you remember we said the third document tells us about who will collect federal government taxes? So that agency is called Nigeria Revenue Service, and it is replacing what we currently know as FIRS. So the Nigeria Revenue Service Establishment Act is the law that establishes the Nigeria Revenue Service and defines its role as the body responsible for collecting and administering taxes that belong to the federal government. So in simple terms, Any tax due to the federal government goes to the Nigeria Revenue Service, NRS. The final document is the Joint Revenue Board Establishment Act. And I'm trying to think about how to properly explain this one. It is mostly about coordination, right? Think about the Joint Revenue Board as referee or the harmonizer of the entire system. Its main job is to ensure that federal, state, and local governments don't fight over your money or charge you for the same thing twice, basically to prevent multiple taxation. States can create their own law, federal government create their own law. If there's nobody that says, this is how everything should work, you might end up having a situation where you have multiple taxes. So some of the things that this JRB, this Joint Revenue Board, does is it establishes the Tax Appeal Tribunal, which is like how do I say it? It's a specialized court for tax issues. They also create the office, according to this law, creates the office of the Tax Ombud. The Tax Ombud is an independent office that fights for your rights. And they investigate administrative abuse by tax officers at no cost to you. So think of this Tax Ombud as human rights office for tax matters. Then they also manage a single database for all taxpayers. So before, Lagos State will give you tax ID, Kano will give you tax ID. But now, whether you're in Lagos, whether you're in Kano, whether you're in Enugu, whether you're in Rivers, wherever you are, you would have one tax ID, and your tax ID will remain the same. So, say you are so what does this particular thing really mean? So let's imagine before, if you are in Lagos State, you collect tax ID in Lagos, so you pay tax in Lagos. So, and then let's say you now took your child to Federal Government College in Ibadan or Kaduna or Port Harcourt or wherever. Most of the time, that agency in that state will say, we don't know you, come and pay tax again. So now that we have it everywhere, that kind of thing should be resolved. But I don't think this one is fully in effect yet, because not all the states have harmonized the law, but we're seeing a lot of those things happening already. So that's number one reason why I think the government decided to do this reform. So to make sure that everything at least makes sense and it comes together. Another reason the government pursued the reforms is to make more money. There's no doubt about it. But while that much is true, on its own, it does not explain the full story. You might be thinking, but where's all the money they are making going to? Where's all the money they are saving from subsidy? Where's all the money government is making? But to give you an idea, the state of Florida in the United States, with approximately 22 million people, size of Lagos State, runs on a budget of 117 billion US dollars. But you see, the whole of Nigeria, which is literally more than 10 times of the population of Florida, runs on a budget that is less than 1/3 of Florida's budget. Anyhow you look at it, this country, Nigeria, does not generate enough revenue to meet its obligations. Not only that, revenue from oil is not stable and it exposes our currency too much to the international market. Our currency's exchange rate used to dangle, with oil prices. And government had to pay some, how do I describe it? They tried to pay some form of subsidy to keep the exchange rate stable in the past. And of course, we all know how that made some people stupendously wealthy and created distortions in the foreign exchange market. But that's a story for another day. But you might then ask, if they just needed to make more money, why don't they just implement and enforce the old tax laws? Why do tax reform, And you're right, but let me try to explain. Please note, I'm not in support of anybody. I'm just explaining what is in the law and my position on these things to you. So why do some new set of laws? And I'll try to give you a couple of reasons. Hopefully you can understand why these reforms were necessary. In the old laws, the system relied on taxing the people it could see, and the people that wear suit and tie, not the people that have money. So as a result, a relatively small group of people was carrying the whole burden for the whole country, literally. So let me try and bring it home. You spend 3 years at home after jamming you for so long, and then you spend 4 years in the university, 1 year NYSC, and then you now get a 75K contract job in one office after 1 year of searching. Immediately you get that job, our old laws would immediately start taxing you. And you see that person that makes 5 million elsewhere, maybe he's just doing something outside, the system. It remains invisible, and of course, he will collect your girlfriend. But anyways, nobody collects taxes from that person, even though he makes more money. But because you are visible, you are wearing suit and tie, they collect tax from you. At the same time, a significant portion of our economic activity as a nation remained, I would say, outside the system entirely. So it was not because, I don't think this was because people were deliberately avoiding tax, right? But the system kind of made it easy for you to stay informal because it was better to remain that way. The moment you try to register your business like this or do things by the book, you suddenly became visible to multiple agencies, multiple levies, this one here, that one there, file this one, file that one. So because of that, people just decided to remain informal. And if you remained informal, nobody will really come and knock your door because they are still knocking the doors of people that were visible. As if that was not enough, the big man that had influence had access to more resources and professionals already. They already have a way, all these big men, they have ways to avoid the system and get big benefits. Yet, they are still the one that the tax laws benefited the most. I'll use something called pioneer legislation, for example. That law created something called the pioneer status incentive that gave companies in certain industries like manufacturing, agriculture, etc. They give them income tax holidays for like 3 to 5 years. Now, the conditions for getting the incentive was in some parts clear, but other parts were very ambiguous, so this led to abuse. Basically, let me bring you to our level. If you know minister or you know somebody that knows somebody that knows somebody, you will collect tax holiday. This was what our old tax laws said. In fact, I've seen cases where somebody will get pioneer status to manufacture something locally, and then he's supposed to manufacture it locally and employ Nigerians, but he will collect the tax holiday and go and import the thing, and he will still enjoy tax holiday. And that's just one of the many areas where the inequality in our old tax system showed up. And that thing was because the rules were scattered and sometimes ambiguous, with different agencies interpreting them as they like. That kind of environment made enforcement discretionary and created room for intimidation. A tax officer can just show up one day, quote one obscure section of an old law, and the easiest thing for the taxpayer to do is just pay something so that the person goes away. Every tax matter then became a little bit of intimidation, negotiation, and abuse, with nobody to come to the aid of the taxpayer. Worst is that most of those monies never made it to the government's account. So we had a system where most people did not pay correctly or consistently. The people that paid taxes are the people that were either the most vulnerable or the most visible. And for others that they will even manage to pay, most of the monies were going into personal pockets instead of government coffers. So basically, the system made compliance difficult, uneven, and at times, sometimes I would say it was unfair. And if the government tries to enforce those old laws as they were, it would only create more chaos, confusion, and conflict. So what am I saying? These reforms, at least in theory, they are an attempt to reset this dynamic by trying to make everything clearer, remove many of these nuisance taxes, all these Naseni, this one, that one. They try to remove them. Then they make people that actually have money should pay more taxes, not people that don't have money, right? Because that old law is if they see you, they collect money from you. This one now, the changes are saying Let the people that have money pay. How are you making 5 million a month and then somebody that is making 70,000 a month is paying more than you, right? It just didn't make sense. And then, I think the reforms also make it more difficult to bypass and make sure that anything you actually pay gets to the government. So while the government needs to make more money, I'll give them credits for not trying to enforce the old laws because, but they're actually trying to make the new ones more equitable so that the registered business that makes 50 million is not worse off than the unregistered one that makes the same 50 million. And the man that makes 100k in an office does not pay more tax than the one that makes 1 million doing online work, right? And that takes me to the next point. Under the old framework, the practical experience for many taxpayers was that they were treated as suspicious by default. So, how do I mean? You are guilty until you are proven innocent instead of, the other way around. Under the old laws, tax authority could launch extensive investigation, sometimes going more than 7 years beyond the statute of limitation, without first establishing any clear evidence of tax fraud or willful default. Refunds were another issue. If you overpaid, getting money back was nearly impossible. In fact, common wisdom was your money don't go once you overpay tax or you mistakenly go and pay more than you're supposed to pay. You just you get credit against future taxes of the same kind, but that could create cash flow headaches for businesses. And these new laws honestly try to flip this around. So you will calculate and declare your own tax liability first. The system gathers data about you and government will verify later. Then no more money don't go problems. At least theoretically, we've not seen it in practice. If you overpay taxes, you are supposed to get it back within a defined timeline. On the other hand, however, to whom much is given, much is expected. So because they have now put the trust in your hands, you can now do as you like. Penalties for false declarations are much harsher. In fact, I think this one is as far back as implemented in 2025 for withholding taxes. If you don't have tax ID, they will charge you double what you're supposed to, to pay in the first place. So trust now goes both ways. So instead of fighting tax officers, you are now accountable to a system with real protections when you play by the rules. The final thing I'll mention is how these tax reforms create a clearer foundation for actually helping the people that need it the most. Think about it this way. If government wanted to distribute cash or subsidy to the poorest Nigerians today, how would they know who qualifies? How do they separate Mr. X making 1 million naira or from Mr. Y that is just collecting minimum wage, Right now, they mostly can't. The old system did not create reliable data about who earns what. Everyone was either invisible or roughly estimated. So they are left with two options. If they want to give everybody something, is that you give everybody, which is physically impossible, or you just rely on informal judgments, which is prone to error and abuse, and that's what we've seen. And my belief is one of the quieter goals of these reforms is to improve economic visibility so that as a country we can make more informed decisions. So when income, employment, and economic activities are better structured within the system, it becomes easier to identify who genuinely need help and who doesn't. Although this does not mean the system is perfect or that it will automatically produce fairness, but with some level of structure and data, targeted support is almost impossible. Without this data, I mean this structure that these new reforms are trying to implement, targeted support is almost impossible to implement and scale. So when you put all of this together, fragmentation of the old laws, difficulty of compliance, revenue problem, reliance on oil, and the need for better structure, the reforms begin to make more sense rather as a first step in the right direction. The old tax system was like a broken leaking pipe, where half of the water never reached the tank. and the pressure was only felt by those at the very end of the line. And these reforms they are an attempt to repipe the whole house, making sure that the pressure is even and water actually goes where it is supposed to go, our schools, roads, and hospitals. But does it solve corruption? No. Does it guarantee good spending by the government? No. And obviously, it does not automatically produce fairness. What it does is to try to replace one of the broken machines in the factory of the Nigerian system and make it harder for the system itself to work against the people inside it. That also means responsibility cuts both ways. If citizens are expected to act correctly within a clearer system, government must also act correctly. Like they must act correctly, spend responsibly, account transparently, and show us how public resources are used. Whether the system succeeds or not is something only time will tell. But understanding the logic and the idea behind it makes it more easier for us to engage with the details calmly and clearly. And that's what the rest of this series is about. In the next video, we'll slow things down and look at the basics, how the tax system works in practical terms, and what every Nigerian should understand before worrying about specifics. See you on the next one.